We have a lot to say, and I'm sure a lot of you have a lot of questions based on the wonderful conversation that Anna had yesterday. And I just love, Abby, that how they blend together, how they become basically the same conversation. So to get it started, I'm going to tell you about this issue. You know, I'm very grateful to Art Papers. I'm very grateful to my co-editor, Sarah Higgins, who invited me to contribute to the creation of this beautiful issue of Art Papers. And for those of you who have it, and for those of you who are thinking about getting it, I highly encourage you get it, especially if you're interested in monumental discourse. And to address some of the questions that people asked yesterday, the theme of this issue are interventions. You know, artists are making interventions into this long history and legacy of monument and memorial making. And so we put together a collection of works for you. Rial Christian is a contributor. Che Gossett is a contributor. Tusif Noor, who some of you may be familiar with here in Philadelphia, is a contributor. Trisha from Monument Lab is a contributor. And so there's a lot of Philly connections to this issue in terms of the physical issue and the issue of monuments, because this is an old city, you know. It features interviews, it features long articles, essays, and it also features a dossier that Sarah Higgins and I created together of artists who we believe are making interventions into this history. And one is Doreen Gardner, who I would love to say I was introduced to at PAFA. So my kind of connection to PAFA is I came to PAFA as a Tina Dunkley Fellow from Clark, Atlanta, and I spent a couple of months up here, a semester, training under Brittany Webb, Jody, and Anna, getting some curatorial experience and really being introduced to Philadelphia. And since then, I've moved here now, you know, under some of the guidance of like Anna, I'm a student at the University of Delaware. And so I'm here for a while and we'll be here for a while, and I'm investing in the discourse that's happening here. So I was invited to teach a course as well, I should say, on monuments. And the concept of the course was really about monumental art. You know, there's this issue with this discourse where we're talking about artwork and we're talking about monuments and memorials, and the issue in between, the conflicts and the tensions in between. This issue is really about art and how artists are kind of just slicing into that discourse, how they're pushing that discourse forward along with activists on the street. That class, we talked about old monuments from the first American monument, the Devil's Tower out west, to Michelle Obama's portrait in the National Gallery, talking about how artists are inserting themselves into a history and legacy that usually excludes them. I want to talk about two contributions I've made to Art Papers in the last year. First, in the spring issue, Toward a Monumental Black Body, which should have been featured in the event description, really talks about how I wanted people to think about the relationship between their bodies and their built environments, specifically when we talk about this discourse in the representation of Black people, Black history, Black culture. What does it really mean to put us into this history, this legacy, especially when considering the visual culture, the history of visual culture in the United States and how it has treated and used the Black body. And it's interdisciplinary work, so it pulls from a lot of different places. If you haven't had the chance to read it, I highly encourage you to read it because it's tied to Monumental Futures. They're speaking to each other. Monumental Futures was my attempt to be a little more positive, because Toward a Monumental Black Body can come off a little heavy and negative, but it was me saying like, you know I'm being very harsh about Kehinde Wiley's monumental artwork, but artists are really pushing this conversation forward, and so are activists. And so these two essays work in tandem to give you a fuller picture of what I'm most interested in. And so Monumental Futures, which is the title of this talk, is also the title of my article. And it's about speculating a future for our landscape that is inspired by the things that artists and activists are doing. And it's foregrounded by Bree Newsom climbing up the flagpole and pulling that Confederate flag down from the State House. And why I'm so interested in that particular moment is because it's a monumental moment. It's a monumental performative moment that kind of exists as performance, as art, as activism, as protest, And it's just, it's iconic. You know, this image will speak to us for generations. And bringing in like Sonia Clark, who had a great show at the Fabric Workshop, it revealed to us that symbols are the site of the battle that we're having right now. We're not necessarily talking about what an object is, what it does, what it's made of, so much as we are talking about symbols and how we personally connect to them. When she pulled that flag down, when it hits the ground, what is it? It's nylon, it's fabric. And Sonia Clark's exhibition and some of the works, one of the works that was acquired by PAFA, shows when you pull it apart, it's just this material we barely value from day to day. The same stuff your book bag is made out of. And I bring that up to situate you as a reader into the conversation on this discourse, to talk about not the object, but the symbols and the meaning of the object behind it. Why do we personally identify and connect to it so much? And so I'm thankful to Dr. Brittany Webb for joining me on this, because I know she has so much to say on the topic, and so do I. So we foreground the conversation by talking about big, well-publicized, well-known interventions that artists are making. And I began with Wangechi Mutu. These are her caryatids that she created outside the Met, called the New Ones. They're titled the Seated 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they were temporary. They sit in the facade, and they're the first objects to sit in the facade outside the Met in New York in its history. And so this is a kind of art historical intervention. It's a kind of institutional intervention, but it's also in material and form an intervention into the structures and aesthetics of monument and memorial making. Brittany, if I could pass it to you.
Sure. And one of the things that I love about the way you frame this in this essay is that in our conversations prepping for this, tacking back and forth between monuments and monumental sculpture, there's this through line about some of these works that we're looking at. And so we're thinking about the architecture of the building. So that image of the State House, Bree Newsom in front of the State House pulling down the Confederate flag. You see this architecture of the building. There's a kind of statist architecture we see in those kinds of columns that is then mimicked in this image that you've pulled from the Wangechi Mutu sculptures in the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And what's fascinating about this is that if we could go to the next slide, they're really these incredible figures. And I'm gonna quote you because you write really lovely about them in the piece. So there's a way you talk about, Mutu enlivening their metallic skin by using patina processes, dressing them in thick coils wrapped around their bodies like a protective armor. There's something really lovely about us thinking about Mutu's practice, fusing all of these kinds of art historical traditions in the pieces, drawing on East African sculpture, classic neo-Roman sculpture. She's thinking about the Black body. She's thinking about what the metal finish will do on these pieces, the mimicking of the lip plates that become mirrors that we can literally walk up to and see ourselves in, whether or not you want to go physically into the museum. There's something really lovely about pulling that into how we're thinking about monumental sculpture. And I think that one of the ways that this conversation is interesting and your dossier is really interesting is that monuments are really contested in this moment. And so speculating on what a future might look like with all of these pieces that are riffing on the Black body in various ways is really productive.
Thank you. I think going back to this last slide, thinking about institutions and how they historically function in our society is extremely important in this conversation, because when we're talking about monuments and monumental artworks, we're not just talking about one object. We're talking about a constellation of power and expression and whose history gets to be told in public space. So whenever you're having this conversation, with your colleagues or your friends or your enemies, make sure that they understand that this is happening in public space. We are not contesting people's private homes or private cemeteries or private museums. We're talking about what people have to live with and see every day when they're walking their kids to school, when they're going to check their mail, when they are jogging in the park. These are the spaces we are meant to politically and philosophically gather and protest should there need be. So, you know, when we talk about public space and the publicness and the sharedness of this space, we're also talking about who gets to participate in being a citizen in these publics in shared spaces. When you build on the legacy, the aesthetic legacy of the United States government, you'll see all of these references to ancient civilizations. And our nation is a baby nation, but some of these buildings look like they will live and last forever because they're referencing what we know of Egypt, what we know of Rome, what we know of Greece. And that's purposeful. You know, Trump released a policy toward the end of his tenure as president saying all of the state buildings have to be built in this style, you know, and that was for me like, see what I'm talking about? This is intentional that we are continuing this kind of a aesthetic legacy in our landscape because it enables some people to power and it erases and it uninvites others to power. And I think Wangechi Mutu's caryatids, the starkness of their existence on this building, they almost look like they just do not and should not exist here. You know, they look like, it's hard to describe. And I love all of the close readings from yesterday's talk, but it's not necessarily, it's referencing all these styles and moving away from them in a way that older sculptures or traditional sculptures do not. The tradition, the East African tradition of the caryatid is a woman's form that traditionally holds up the stool of the king, holds up the weight of a building's roof. It supports using the woman's form. But when Wangechi Mutu specifically said, I don't want my caryatids to carry that weight. And when you place a body like these bodies that look almost alien, these bodies that look like ancestors, when you place them on a building with the kind of architecture that the Met has, refusing to hold the weight, sitting in their power, sitting in their singularity, understanding that they're not meant to be there forever, understanding that they may be acquired or put somewhere else or separated, is a moment, just like that Brie-Newsome moment of defiance, which to me as a citizen, as a historian, as a Black person walking down the street, I see those caryatids and I think of myself defying these institutions, me not carrying the weight, whatever that weight may be for what I do in this field, you know. And that is to me so significant and so powerful about these works. What does it mean to not carry the weight? What does it mean to have a symbol added onto our landscape of defiance? Please.
No, I mean, I'd love for us to move between the Wangechi Mutu and your interest in Simone Lee's sculpture, because I think that there's something really important about both the fact of the ways that this works are riffing on bodies read as Black and female, but also are defying our senses of monumental public sculpture as depicting any particular figure. And I think that there's a way that your interest in iconoclasm, in defiance, in what it means for a work to have been constructed with particular kinds of global art historical traditions in mind on the one hand, and thinking about what those works do once they're installed in particular spaces on the other hand is really productive, because that's sort of the tension I think that you're getting at when we're thinking about iconoclasm. It's not just what the monumental sculpture does on its own as an object, as a gorgeous work of art, but also what it means for these works of art to sit in the places that they're sitting.
That's exactly it. And when I think of Simone Lee, I have so many feelings, you know, just in general, just as an art viewer. But when I think of her in relation to this history of sculpture and this history of monumental sculpture specifically, there's so much defiance even in the embodiment of this object. What does it mean to show a Black woman's form with no eyes? What does it mean for her to not give you access in that way? You know, art historically, we talk about eyes. Culturally, we talk about eyes being the windows to the soul. We talk about the kind of access and vulnerability that Black women tend to have in art historical discourse, that nude body, that used body, that laborious body. What happens when they refuse to be that for you in all forms? And Simone Lee's work is an amalgamation of a kind of Black feminist philosophy, not necessarily a Black woman's form. And so what we're looking at isn't a sculpture of a Black woman, even though I refer to her as a her, brick house. We're looking at this totem of Black femininity. And what does that mean to have an artist placing work like this in our landscape and saying, it's not for you, it's specifically for Black women? What does that mean today specifically? What does that mean in our history, art historical discourse, to only have a work that is for, by and for a Black woman? That's revolutionary.
It's also, there's a way that in reading it as a Black body, as a vessel, or as a fortress. This is an image of Brick House, which is now at the corner of 34th and Walnut here in West Philadelphia, on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. And so I think that there's something really interesting about having this kind of Black inspired fortress female figure that moves from Chelsea in New York City, where the way that you encounter it in public space is, you know, literally from the street. You can look up at it. If you go back to that view, like you kind of, both the Lee install in New York and the Mutu install in New York, you sort of have to take a position almost of reverence, sort of standing back and looking up at these works in a kind of awe. That is the kind of visceral experience you have interacting with these sculptures before you get into a kind of close reading of them. And I think there's something really fascinating about the way that it's installed in West Philadelphia on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, near the Arts and Sciences building at Penn. So that geography imbues that work with a different kind of meaning. And, you know, when we think about iconoclasm in these spaces, you know, what is the work that this does as a kind of monumental public sculpture that may be there forever, but may not be there forever, right? I think that the ways that we have talked about actual sort of state-sponsored monuments, the conversation has gone from, you know, what it means to want something to come down out of a public space. How do we reckon with what some of these monuments are meant to symbol in terms of state power? When people want them to come down, where should they go? I think there's still some value to the fact that the monumental works that we're talking about are in public, so that they're absolutely backed by institutions, but you don't necessarily have to physically interact with an institution to interact with this work. That feels like its own kind of breaking in a particular tradition.
Yeah, exactly. It's so hard to defend some kind of programming or exhibition being for a community when a community has to pay to get into it. All of the artists we mentioned today do the kind of slippage work of putting their work where it is most accessible, even if it doesn't last forever, even if it is still in conversation with these institutions. In the question section of the last talk, a lot of people were looking for a kind of solution to dealing with the legacies, the histories of the United States. How do these monuments play a role in peacemaking, pacifying, all of those kinds of concerns? And for me, that's not even the question. The question, we're not about pacifying histories. We're about telling histories, and the histories we need to tell right now. You know, a lot of people, and I say this in the article, a lot of people think that putting up a statue of a Black body of like Harriet Tubman is a solution to removing a sculpture. This seems pointless. What does it matter if there's a beautiful sculpture of Harriet Tubman if right next to that there's an underfunded school, if right next to that, you know, there's environmental concerns, if right next to that there's rent, there's no rent control. It's a systemic issue. All of these things have to speak in tandem. So what happens when they do that? What happens when we are allowed to see the inequities on the bodies of our sculptures? And Simone Lee's work kind of does something beautiful in that she's not shying away from how the Black woman's body in our visual culture has been objectified. She is referencing Kwanzaa huts, she's referencing corroded pipes and metals and skillets and calabashes, because that for even arguably today is how people view the Black woman's body in our culture. She is to be used. She is to be objectified. She is a form of, maybe not even gendered, depending on what discourse you're jumping into. Simone Lee doesn't shy away from that. Her sculptures get to be that object, and they also get to be rich interior forms of what it means to be human in this space, in the legacies and the histories of the United States as a nation, which is ridiculously revolutionary if you think about it in relation to a sculpture, a figurative, straightforward sculpture of a Black woman. She's adding on layers and layers that kind of slip temporalities and slip geographies. And one of the most powerful things about Simone Lee's work, moving from New York to right down the street from me here in West Philadelphia, and Kehinde Wiley's work, moving from New York to Richmond, Virginia, is that they move. What does it mean to have monuments that move? I think one, it breaks that belief that something in a space, it's too expensive to move. No, you just get a couple of trucks and you lift it up and you move it. And what does it mean to place these objects, regardless of what they're depicting, in new contexts, from one context to another context, from Times Square to an art museum tangential to Confederate Row, from the High Line in New York to a college campus. And who gets to experience this? What does it mean for the Black women on Penn's campus who may have felt like they can't fully participate in what it means to be a student at an Ivy League institution, to walk through their campus and hit upon Simone Lee's work and know, just like a totem, that this is for me, nobody else but me? You know, I think that's revolutionary.
This also is really fascinating that we're having this conversation about works that are dealing with Blackness and embodiment and adornment. The way that Mutu's seated ones have these kinds of protective coils that look like adornment, but also look like a kind of body armor. You know, all of these lovely rope-like robes, the way that you can read in Simone Lee's sculpture that on the one hand, below the neck, the figure is a kind of vessel, the figure is an architecture, but you still have those braids with the sculpture of, like, at the very end there, those braids are sort of closed off by cowrie shells, which is like very much a Black vernacular object to a lot of people. And if we could move on through the, you know, the way that you talk about Hank Willis Thomas, you know, all power to all people, the Afro pick that was installed at Payne Plaza downtown in Philadelphia for Monument Lab. This is also about a Black vernacular object that's associated with Black embodiment and adornment. But in this case, it's associated with, you know, the Black Power movements in the 1960s and 70s, and like this kind of object that was like a symbol for natural hair. And it does, I think, a kind of work in the space that it was installed, you know, downtown, right in between City Hall and the Municipal Services Building, that changed what that space meant for people who interacted with that work, walking by it, were surprised by it when it was on view all the time. That just, it had a moment that felt newly necessary to us, I think, in 2020.
Absolutely. I mean, this whole article could have just focused on Hank Willis Thomas's work. I call it monumental because it is at a monumental scale, but referencing back to Toward a Monumental Black Body, what I am attempting to do is to get people to think about the critical ways in which they make monuments and memorials of everyday objects, specifically Black people, specifically the objects that we use to remember our histories, to share our histories, to mourn, to celebrate. So that vernacular culture that Hank Willis Thomas is tapping into is everything that I'm interested in. I am not an art historian. I'm barely a historian, but what I'm very invested in is material.
Sorry, TK, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how that happened. But what I'm very invested in is material culture. And so Hank Willis Thomas does, he puts all of my interests into one object. What is an element of Black material culture? A recognizable, iconic image, object, material that is accessible to every person, that embodies ideas, symbols that Black people can gain strength from, can recognize and relate to. And the Black Power pick, you know, is something I had as a kid. You know, it's something that I've if I look at photos of my family members, they've had this pick. It's something that costs 99 cents at the beauty supply store, but it's something that is so tied to the idea of recognizing your own beauty and celebrating your own beauty, recognizing your culture, celebrating your culture, resisting Eurocentric beauty standards, sliced right in the middle of Center City. What does that do for someone like me who is looking for myself represented in my landscape? This physically looks like an intervention. It is slicing through the landscape, juxtaposed with that city hall that has a history and a legacy of its own of either oppressing or uplifting Black people, of Black people having to compromise possibly who they are to exist in this political space. It's amazing. And I think back to like Simone Lee's work and thinking about what does it mean to have a work specifically for a Black woman on our landscape. And I think back to Wangechi Mutu's work, and I think, what does it mean to have a work that is specifically for speculating what a Black future might look like in our landscape? And I go back to Hank Willis Thomas, and I think, well, this is it. This is a valuing of Black cultural productions on a public scale. It's not in your back pocket. It's not in my house. It's on the street. And when we put it in conversation with other sculptures, what does it say about those other sculptures? What does it start to say about how we are living and existing in our world? You know, there are so many anxieties that come from the idea of our landscape completely changing. There's anxiety that comes from there being an empty plinth, or a team you celebrated since your childhood with your parents no longer having a mascot, or the elementary school you went to no longer having the same name. There's a lot of anxiety with that because we tie our identities to these objects. It's not the material so much as it is the symbolism. We want to be a part of these things, and we want these things to be a part of us. And that anxiety is exacerbated when people of color, you know, marginalized communities start putting a little bit of themselves into it, because some people can't necessarily relate to that. And it becomes a discourse. It becomes a push and pull of whose history is tied to this particular object, whose history is tied to this one. I'm sorry, I don't know why my mic keeps muting. Brittany, if you want to take over, I would like to figure out what's happening.
No, that's okay. I mean, I think part of what I appreciate you calling attention to the kind of contestation and anxiety that happens, because some of what is fraught is these kinds of pairings. You know, that the Hank Willis Thomas's "All Power to All People" was installed within like the same vista as the Frank Rizzo statue at Thomas Paine Plaza, which, for folks who are not Philadelphians, you know, Rizzo, for so many Black Philadelphians, represents the brutal kinds of state power, that the brutal municipal power that Frank Rizzo wielded during the kind of reign of terror over a police force over Black people in 1970s Philadelphia. And so the statue didn't go up until the 1990s, which is really interesting when we think about the amount of time in between the end of Confederate statues and at the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Confederate statues starting to go up to memorialize them. What's happening in Philadelphia in 1998 that makes it the perfect year for a statue of Frank Rizzo to go up at the Municipal Services Building? Somebody who was really known as being really brutal on Black people in the form of, you know, just beating the crap out of Black people in Philadelphia. Encouraging the police force to beat the crap out of Black people in Philadelphia. Part of what's really fascinating about the Afro-pick as a Black vernacular symbol is that it's associated with natural hair, which is itself one of the ways that Black bodies are policed in this country. You know, TK, when you point to it being against the architecture of City Hall, when we think about the ways that we've had conversations around natural Black hair in professional spaces, whether or not that counts as professional. You know, I think about there's a really excellent new exhibition catalog out for through the Zimmerli Art Museum at Rutgers University that's on the iconography of activist and scholar Angela Davis. And one of the conversations that happens around her as an iconic figure of Black Power movements in the 1960s and 70s were around the ways that her depiction on FBI wanted posters were so widely spread. That image of her with the afro became a way that Black women in California were literally policed. She was on the run, and the way that police went looking for her were to stop every Black woman with natural hair because she might be Angela Davis. And so to think about the politics of Black natural hair as associated with this symbol that is not only just, you know, an object that you need for your everyday kind of grooming, but also as a symbol of a kind of maintenance of an aspect of your body that is not just sort of policed in terms of the way we think and move through the world and culture, but literally the tool by which police hunt people down and decide that they are targets for state violence. That becomes an interesting juxtaposition in this place, in this physical space, in this time. And if we could go to the next slide, TK, I really want to call attention to how contested this is, how visceral a reaction this brings up for people. This is an image of the Rizzo statue over the summer. So this is June 2020 when we had several uprisings all over the country over a series of unarmed Black people being killed by the police in different parts of the country. And so one of the ways that this coalesced around Payne Plaza in Philadelphia was around this Rizzo statue. And so every time, you know, we who are in museums or in art are talking about monuments, and there's always sort of a thread of people who imagines that these are not as important as they are. But then you have these kinds of flashpoints where protesters are not just gathering at these monuments, but they want them to come down. And so here you're seeing the Rizzo statue having been defaced by protesters the day before. That rope you're seeing hanging from Rizzo's arm. There are numerous images you can find on the internet of crowds of people trying to pull down this sculpture and being unable to. And so if we think about the physicality of this object, what it means to have this kinds of monumental bronze sculpture installed in such a way that when a crowd of people want to pull this sculpture down, they're unable to. And yet somehow the city's response to it, or the state response to it, is still to give it this kind of extra protection, this thing that this crowd could not pull down, the idea that it still needed an investment of resources to protect this. You know, these lines of cops. There were various points during the uprisings where this statue was more protected than people in the city of Philadelphia, than other vulnerable spaces in the city of Philadelphia. And this is not, you know, theory. I mean, if you think about the fact that this is all, everyone in uniform in this image is on payroll, funded by our taxpayer dollars. So the idea that we're all investing these kinds of cultural resources, political resources, economic resources into protecting a thing that people tried to destroy but couldn't, that's I think as important as the conversation we're having around wanting contemporary artists to be the people who lead us through these thorny conversations. And in fact, this became a statue that was removed because of public safety issues. You know, there had been an outcry around this Rizzo statue being at Payne Plaza for a long time. And what sped up the urgency of its removal was a conversation around safety. And I feel like that's also part of this conversation around what kinds of monumental works that we want to see in public spaces, and what the futures of monuments might look like for us.
And you hit up against so much of what I'm interested in. It's so hard. I want to talk about iconoclasm, but I'm going to pull it back to the body. Toward a Monumental Black Body and Monumental Futures center on your physical body's interaction with extensions of the state, extensions of state power like monuments. The difference between a monument and a monumental artwork, if we were to juxtapose these two images, is one is protected by the state and the other one is not. You know, when we're having this conversation, think about who the state is giving its resources to maintain. These are expensive objects. They don't just look beautiful every day, year after year. They take maintenance, they take repair. And when you know, protests happen, they take, You need someone to go out and clean it and fix it and guards to protect it. But in a landscape like this that we're living in now, people could easily see how unequal we are. It shows us how unequal we are when that body is protected more than the vulnerable bodies that are out there, the people who pay taxes, the people who are living in this moment. I encourage people to think about their own bodies in relation to these symbols. You know, I prefer monuments to be seen as tableaus. I love iconoclasm. I think it's extremely important. I love graffiti. I think it is the language of our most vulnerable populations. What happens if we start reading graffiti instead of erasing it? What happens if graffiti is a conversation with these objects? You know, we talk about putting things in context. Let's put them in the context of where we live. If I say FTP on a sculpture of a former police chief of the city I live in, obviously we have some issues in our society. That's real and that's true. Protecting this and pretending like that doesn't happen is not true. That is aspirational, maybe. You know, that is fantastical most of the time. What happens if our monuments start to look true? And what happens when we have symbols that ask for truth? Black is beautiful. That's a truth that I believe. When I'm looking at Hank Willis Thomas's work, All Power to All People, what happens when we remind people of the power that they have within their own bodies? I start Monumental Futures with Bree Newsome because knowing the risk, knowing that she would be arrested, knowing that that flag would be put back up there, she shimmied up there anyway and grabbed that in her fist, grabbed that flag and pulled it down herself. And that's her using her own body in this nation that we live in the landscape we live in, to try to make this place better for people like her. And yes, that's vulnerable, but that's the point. Every choice we make in living in this society, every time we vote for something, every time we shop at a particular grocery store or don't shop somewhere, we are making a choice about upholding or not upholding these institutions. When we think about who has the power in a society against the government, Hank Willis Thomas is reminding us that we have the power in this society against this government. It's people that have the power. And when you empower one community, you have the power to empower all. Civil rights helped every creed and color in the United States, not just Black people. And so it's asking people to value the things that they create, specifically Black people. But it's also asking us to create symbols for our nation that push us towards the truth. Where are we living? What legacies are we dealing with? What do we need right now? What do people need right now?
And I think that mobility and accessibility are such huge parts of this conversation. So we're looking at another edition of Hank Willis Thomas's All Power to All People. And I will say that the original is in PAFA's permanent collection, which we're really proud of, because we all know that, you know, at the close of Monument Lab, which was this fantastic project, there are ways that we who know how artworks circulate and the kind of maintenance requires always knows that there's a risk that things that start off as public can be taken out of public circulation and go into various kinds of private collections that make it so we're not actually able to interact with them anymore. And so one of the things we love about having All Power to All People be in PAFA's collection is that it has a home in Philadelphia, and it meant a lot to Philadelphians. And one of the ways that we saw this is that this also, you know, during the summer, this larger edition, I believe the 7,000 pound edition of All Power to All People was installed in several empty lots in Philadelphia. And it became a kind of pilgrimage almost, that when it was in North Philly, you went to see it there. When it was in West Philly, you went to see it there. This version actually, you know, the poles like lit up at night. So it also became this kind of light feature. If you were walking through a neighborhood, that the light literally drew you to the piece. And for me, I live near 52nd and Arch Street. When this went up, it really was this incredible moment to see this kind of monumental sculpture in this just a neighborhood, which is not the kind of, which typically are not the places where you encounter monuments. They tend to be in sort of city squares. And so there's another way that artists, I think, are really pushing us in thinking about iconoclasm and thinking about what it means for the works to move. I think that it can really trouble how we think about what we expect monuments to do for us, because sometimes I do think that we are asking too much of these objects, even as we acknowledge that they can ignite conversations, that they can stage confrontations, that they can remind us that everything is contested in ways that are incredibly productive. There is still at its core all of these ways that part of what makes that work is their impermanence. And so that really troubles what I think we imagine we want from monuments. And I see we have a lot of comments in the chat.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I'd love to sort of open this up. You guys have been really busy.
Yeah, just a reminder, I mean, huge thank you, Brittany and TK, for sharing this, your thoughts on these amazing images, and for everyone for putting comments in the chat for this important conversation. If anyone would like to ask a question verbally, if you want, just a reminder, you can raise your hand. There's a raise your hand function under the participant button, and we will unmute you. I wanted to maybe go back. There was a question towards the beginning of the program, and about placement of monuments that I thought was a really interesting one to tie in. And sorry, as I scroll through, by Pam McDonald. So noting that the placement of these monuments of Black womanhood are sometimes placed in, and she put in quotes, white locations, and especially I think the High Line. But is there something significant about this placement in front of predominantly white spaces, or maybe what has been coded as a white space? Is that a confrontation against white audiences, and how do they communicate power and strength to the Black women they depict? I throw that to either of you.
I'll take it first if you don't mind, Brittany. Thank you for your question. I think I got into a conversation with an artist about how these objects being able to move is a negative. You know, the goal for that artist was that they be permanent, just like a monument, that they be accepted by the state and protected in the same way. And my response was that there's something extremely diasporic way that these can move and how they become accessible to the people who need them most when you initially conceive them of being able to move from context to context and from space to space. With Simone Lee's work, you know, I think there are specific institutional powers that move it from one place to another, but regardless of where it is moved, it is public enough to become a pilgrimage, to use Brittany's word. It's public enough to be exposed. And I think of where we are the most vulnerable, right? And I'm thinking about like how the Hank Willis Thomas's All Power to All People at the courthouse, next to that Rizzo sculpture, next to the hall, speaks to many histories, many conflicts of power, right? Across race and culture. It's a confrontation to the state. If we're talking about Simone Lee on a campus, I'm thinking of her as being in conversation with the people who are most vulnerable in that space. And no, it's not necessarily perfect, but this is only its second position. You know, where is it going to move next? If it does move, where is another? You know, she's representing the United States in the Venice Biennale. What does it mean to have work by a woman making work for Black women representing the United States? What does that even mean? That's something I haven't fully realized for myself. But she's not making work for the world, and she's not making work for the United States. She's making work for Black women. What does it mean to have that work in a Biennale? You know, Brittany.
I mean, and at the same time, that is, as you know, American Black women are like a uniquely American formation. And so at the same time, that is a kind of, that on the global stage, that does do a different kind of in these different locations. I think part of what is great about thinking about what that work does on the High Line is that the surprise of seeing this kind of work not necessarily even at the High Line, but even if you're riding through that neighborhood or walking through that neighborhood and you look up and you have this unexpected interaction, part of the surprise is part of the work that the work can do in the world, right? I think that that's the same sort of feature that the Afropic has and that Brick House has at 34th and Walnut on Penn's campus. Part of even if we think of those spaces as white space, and I absolutely, I'm sensitive to the reading of the University of Pennsylvania as being in white space. But I wonder if we think of West Philadelphia as a neighborhood as white space, how that complicates our reading of the location of this work, particularly in this moment. Locally, there are so many conversations about the contested relationship between Penn and the community, around policing, around race, and currently around coronavirus and the relationship between the university having students on campus, neighborhood of West Philadelphia, not being part of the conversation around what that means for the safety of people who live around that campus in the middle of a pandemic. I do think that there still is something really delicious and unexpected about our surprise at encountering this kind of Black embodiment work in spaces where we don't expect, that I hope can pull us toward thinking about, well, when we say that in a separate conversation that there are other kinds of monuments that we want to come down, what do we want to go up in their place? Or what do we want to go up in other kinds of places?
And, I'm coming from a similar kind of situation in St. Louis. I went to St. Louis University, and I'm not from St. Louis. So when I moved to St. Louis and realized that the population is almost the largest population of the city, I was looking for the material evidence of Black people in that city. And if you go around St. Louis, there aren't a lot of Black history markers. The Black History Museum is defunded, not defunded, but poorly funded. And Black people have been redlined and regulated to these particular spaces. But the history of Black people in St. Louis is in every inch of that city. Dred Scott was buried originally under the parking garage at my university. No markers for that. So when we start to put these objects back into place? That's what I kind of mean when I say across temporalities, because we're not just talking about what a place is now. We're talking about, and this is, I think, specifically important too when we think about markers to Indigenous histories, Indigenous cultures. What does it mean to bring them back to these spaces, to give them the space that they originally belonged to, that belonged to them, have a history and relationship with? And be transformative about it, and not shy away from the histories that have happened since, which I think Simone Lee deals with in her work. And